Sometimes the worst mistakes happen when we think we're doing the right thing. Sheriff Raymond Pike pulled the trigger to protect his town, but the man weeping over the dying dog wasn't a threat at all. Thomas Ashford was a war hero, and Duke was his last friend in the world. The town of Dry Hollow now faces a choice between pride and doing what's right. When the wronged man won't fight back, can the sheriff find the courage to make things right? What happens when forgiveness becomes harder to find than revenge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Hollow's main street, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and rust. This was a town caught between two worlds, the fading frontier and the creeping march of progress that threatened to swallow places like this whole. Wooden sidewalks still groaned under the weight of boots and wagon wheels, while the newly installed telegraph poles stood like sentinels promising connection to a wider world that most folks here weren't sure they wanted. Sheriff Raymond Pike had walked this same route every morning for 20 years, his boots finding the familiar rhythm that spoke of duty and routine. At 53, he carried himself with the straight-backed authority of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. His badge, inherited from his father before him, caught the early light, a piece of hammered silver that had kept the peace in Dry Hollow since before the railroad came through. Pike's father had told him once that wearing that badge meant making the hard choices, the ones that kept decent people safe in their beds at night. The town trusted him. Mrs. Patterson at the general store always had his coffee ready at 7 sharp, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Doc Henley nodded respectfully from his porch each morning, pipe smoke curling around his weathered features. Mayor Walsh made a point of greeting him warmly whenever their paths crossed, as if Pike's presence alone could solve the mounting pressures that kept the mayor awake at night. Those pressures were real enough. Cattle rustlers had been working the territory, bold enough to hit ranches within a day's ride of town. Drifters came through more frequently now, some looking for honest work, others bringing trouble that followed them like dust clouds. The railroad brought commerce, but it also brought strangers with strange ways and questionable intentions. Pike had seen towns torn apart by the kind of lawlessness that crept in when authority went soft. He wouldn't let that happen to Dry Hollow. Not on his watch. 3 miles east of town, where the creek bent around a stand of cottonwoods, Thomas Ashford was beginning his own morning routine. At 41, he possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving things most men couldn't imagine. His cabin sat back from the road, modest and well-maintained, with a small garden that showed the careful attention of someone who understood the value of growing things in hard ground. Duke, a massive German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes, padded alongside Thomas as they made their daily rounds. The dog moved with a limp, an old injury that had never quite healed right, but his devotion to the tall, bearded man was absolute. They'd been through hell together, these two. Though Thomas rarely spoke of those days to anyone in town, the Congressional Medal of Honor lay hidden in a wooden box beneath Thomas's bed, wrapped in an old shirt that still smelled faintly of gunpowder and blood. He'd earned it during the frontier wars, leading a desperate cavalry charge that had saved an entire unit from certain death. The newspapers had called him a hero, but Thomas knew better. Heroes were the men who didn't come home. He was just someone who'd been too stubborn to die when dying might have been easier. Duke had been there that day, one of several military dogs trained to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield. While Thomas rallied the surviving cavalry, Duke had worked methodically through the carnage, locating 6 men who would have died without his nose for finding life among the dead. The dog had taken shrapnel in his left hip during the fighting, but he'd kept working until every man was accounted for. They'd retired together, these 2 veterans, finding their way to Dry Hollow because it was far enough from everything to let a man heal in peace. Thomas worked his small ranch with quiet efficiency, selling enough cattle to get by while avoiding the attention that came with success. He preferred it that way. Fame was a burden he'd never wanted, and the medal in the box under his bed felt more like a weight than an honor. The townspeople knew something of his story, though Thomas had never been one to share details. Doc Henley, who'd served as an army medic in his younger days, recognized the look of a man carrying invisible wounds. Rachel Morrison, the schoolteacher, remembered Thomas from before the war, when he'd been young and eager, full of dreams about seeing the world beyond Dry Hollow's borders. He'd come back different, older in ways that went deeper than years. Duke was his anchor to something approaching peace. The dog seemed to understand the silence that sometimes settled over Thomas like a heavy coat, staying close without being intrusive. They developed their own language of gestures and glances, the kind of communication that came from shared experience and mutual trust. When the nightmares came, Duke would rest his large head on Thomas's chest, a warm weight that reminded him he wasn't alone in the darkness. On this particular morning, as Pike made his rounds and Thomas tended to his ranch, neither man could have imagined how their separate lives were about to collide. The town moved through its familiar rhythms, merchants opening their shops, children walking to school, the daily business of a community that had found its balance between order and freedom. Pike stopped by the telegraph office, where young Jimmy Hartwell sorted through the morning's messages with the serious concentration of someone who took his responsibilities to heart. "Anything from the territorial marshal?" Pike asked, though he already knew the answer. The rustlers were still out there, and the lack of leads was beginning to weigh on him. "Nothing yet, Sheriff," Jimmy replied, adjusting his spectacles. Though there was a wire from Millerville. They lost another dozen head last week. Pike's jaw tightened. Millerville was only 2 days' ride north, close enough to suggest the rustlers were working in a pattern that might eventually lead them to Dry Hollow. The responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. Every stolen cow, every nervous rancher, every sleepless night in town was a reflection of his ability to keep the peace. Meanwhile, Thomas was repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by the previous night's wind. Duke lay nearby in the shade, ears alert to every sound in the surrounding countryside. The dog's training had never really left him. He still scanned for threats with the systematic attention of a soldier on patrol. But here, in this quiet place, where the biggest danger was usually a rattlesnake sunning itself on a rock, Duke had found something approaching contentment. Thomas worked methodically, his hands steady, despite the slight tremor that sometimes came when he was tired. The war had left its marks on his body as well as his spirit, old wounds that ached in cold weather, reflexes that never quite relaxed, a hypervigilance that made sleep difficult. But the physical work of ranching helped quiet his mind, gave him something tangible to focus on when memories threatened to pull him back to places he'd rather not revisit. The fence post was stubborn, refusing to sit straight in the hard-packed earth. Thomas paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, and looked out across the valley that had become his home. Dry Hollow sprawled in the distance like a child's drawing of what a town should be, neat lines of buildings clustered around the main street, smoke rising from chimneys, the whole scene painted in earth tones under the endless blue sky. He'd made peace with this life, or as close to peace as a man like him could expect. The isolation suited him, and the work gave his hands something useful to do. Duke provided companionship without judgment, and the occasional trips to town for supplies gave him just enough human contact to avoid becoming a complete hermit. What Thomas couldn't know was that Sheriff Pike had been watching his place lately, making note of the solitary figure who kept to himself and the large dog that accompanied him everywhere. In Pike's experience, men who avoided company usually had reasons worth investigating. The sheriff's growing anxiety about maintaining order had begun to cast shadows over even innocent behavior. The two men were on a collision course that neither could see coming, their separate worlds about to intersect in ways that would test everything they believed about justice, redemption, and the possibility of healing old wounds. The morning sun climbed higher, shortening the shadows on Dry Hollow's main street, and the day moved forward with the inexorable weight of fate. The incident that would change everything began with something as ordinary as a trip to town for supplies. Thomas had loaded his wagon with the few items he couldn't produce on his ranch: salt, coffee, ammunition for hunting, and a small bag of peppermint candy that he'd developed a fondness for during the long winter evenings. Duke rode beside him on the wagon seat, ears pricked forward at the familiar sights and sounds of their monthly journey to Dry Hollow. It was approaching noon when they reached the outskirts of town, the sun high enough to bleach the color from the dusty streets. Thomas guided the wagon past the residential section, where modest homes sat behind picket fences, their small gardens showing the careful attention of people who understood the value of every green thing in this harsh country. A few children waved from their yards, and Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, though he didn't smile. Social pleasantries had never come easily to him, even before the war. Duke's behavior began to change as they approached the main street. The dog's ears flattened slightly, and he shifted restlessly on the wagon seat, nose working to process scents that Thomas couldn't detect. Years of partnership had taught Thomas to trust Duke's instincts completely. The dog's senses had saved both their lives more times than either cared to remember. "What is it, boy?" Thomas murmured, his own alertness sharpening in response to Duke's unease. The dog whined softly, a sound he rarely made, and Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came when something wasn't right. Sheriff Pike had been having a difficult morning. The telegram from the territorial marshal had finally arrived, bringing news that the rustlers had struck again, this time hitting a ranch just 30 miles south. The pattern was tightening around Dry Hollow like a noose, and Pike could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him from every direction. Mayor Walsh had cornered him earlier, speaking in the carefully modulated tones of a politician, trying not to appear openly critical, while making his concerns perfectly clear. "The townspeople are getting nervous. Raymond," Walsh had said, his pale hands fidgeting with his pocket watch. "They're looking to you to keep them safe. If something were to happen here, if we can't maintain order," the implied threat hung in the air between them. Pike's authority rested on his ability to protect the community, and everyone knew it. Any sign of weakness, any suggestion that he couldn't handle the challenges facing Dry Hollow, would erode the foundation of respect he'd spent 20 years building. When Pike spotted Thomas's wagon approaching the general store, something in the sheriff's mind clicked into a pattern of suspicion that had been building for weeks. Here was a man who kept to himself, who avoided social contact, who appeared in town just irregularly enough to seem suspicious. The large dog at his side looked alert, possibly aggressive, and Pike's imagination began filling in details that weren't necessarily there. Thomas climbed down from the wagon and tied the reins to the hitching post in front of Patterson's general store. Duke jumped down beside him, stretching his legs after the ride, and Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears in an automatic gesture of affection. Several townspeople were on the street, going about their daily business, and Thomas nodded politely to those who met his eyes. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her store, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She'd always been kind to Thomas, treating him with the respectful courtesy she showed all her customers, though she sensed the sadness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. "Good afternoon, Mr. Ashford," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine welcome. "I've got that coffee you like in stock, and some of those peppermints if you're interested." Thomas was reaching into his pocket for his small list of needed items when Duke suddenly stiffened beside him. The dog's lips pulled back slightly from his teeth, not in aggression, but in the kind of warning display that had preceded life-saving alerts during their military service. Duke was reacting to something, a scent, a sound, some subtle indication of danger that only he could perceive. Sheriff Pike, watching from across the street, saw only what his anxious mind was prepared to see: a large dog showing signs of aggression in the middle of town, surrounded by innocent civilians who might be in danger. The sheriff's hand moved instinctively to his gun, the weight of his father's badge seeming to press against his chest like a reminder of duty. "That dog looks like trouble," Pike muttered to himself, his voice tight with the kind of certainty that comes from fear, disguised as authority. He'd seen dogs go bad before, had watched peaceful animals turn dangerous without warning. In his current state of mind, every shadow looked like a threat. Every unusual behavior seemed like a precursor to violence. Duke's warning wasn't about aggression, it was about protection. The dog had detected something that triggered his deepest training, the instincts that had made him invaluable on the battlefield. But Pike couldn't see past his own preconceptions, couldn't read the subtle differences between a dog preparing to attack and one preparing to defend. "Hey!" Pike called out, his voice carrying across the street with the sharp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Control that animal!" Thomas looked up, confused by the sheriff's tone and the accusation implied in his words. Duke was sitting calmly beside him, alert but showing no signs of the aggression Pike seemed to be seeing. "Sheriff, there's no problem here," Thomas said, his voice level and respectful. "Duke's just—" But Pike was already moving, crossing the street with the determined stride of a man convinced he was preventing a tragedy. His hand rested on the butt of his gun, and his face showed the kind of grim resolve that preceded irreversible action. The townspeople on the street began to notice the confrontation, stepping back with the instinctive caution of people who recognize the potential for violence. I said, "Control that dog," Pike shouted, his voice rising with the adrenaline that comes from perceived threat. "Look at him, he's about to attack." Thomas looked down at Duke, seeing only the faithful companion who'd shared his exile from the world. The dog was tense, yes, but not in the way Pike was describing. Duke was responding to the sheriff's aggressive approach, reading the threat in Pike's body language and preparing to protect his human if necessary. "Sheriff Pike." "Please," Thomas said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "He's not aggressive. He's just—" The sound of Pike's gun leaving its holster cut through Thomas's words like a blade. The sheriff held the weapon with practiced steadiness, pointing it directly at Duke's chest, and Thomas felt the world narrow to a single point of terrible clarity. "Don't!" Thomas shouted, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. The gunshot echoed off the buildings lining Main Street, a sound so sharp and final that it seemed to silence everything else in the world. Duke's body jerked once, then crumpled to the dusty ground, dark blood spreading beneath him like spilled paint. Thomas dropped to his knees beside his fallen companion, his hands shaking as he gathered Duke's head into his lap. The dog's amber eyes looked up at him with the same trust and devotion they'd always shown, even as life began to fade from them. "No, no, no," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking in a way it hadn't since the war. "Duke, stay with me, boy. Please stay with me." The crowd that had gathered stood in stunned silence, watching a man's heart break in real time. Mrs. Patterson had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Doc Henley pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. But one look at Duke told him there was nothing to be done. Sheriff Pike stood with his gun still drawn, his face pale, but set in lines of stubborn justification. "The animal was dangerous," he announced to the crowd, though his voice lacked the conviction he was trying to project. "I had to act to protect the community," but even as he spoke the words, Pike could see the doubt in the faces around him. He could see Thomas cradling the dying dog with a gentleness that spoke of deep love, and something cold began to settle in the sheriff's stomach. Duke's breathing grew shallow, then stopped altogether. Thomas remained kneeling in the dust, holding his friend's still body, and the silence that followed was more damning than any accusation could have been. The badge on Pike's chest had never felt heavier. The silence that followed Duke's death seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the sound of Thomas's quiet breathing as he knelt in the dust beside his fallen companion. The crowd that had gathered maintained a respectful distance, their faces showing the kind of uncomfortable witness that comes when tragedy strikes in broad daylight. Doc Henley was the first to move, setting down his medical bag and approaching Thomas with the careful steps of a man who understood grief. "Son," he said softly, his weathered hand coming to rest on Thomas's shoulder. "I'm truly sorry." Thomas didn't look up immediately. His hands continued to stroke Duke's still warm fur, and when he finally raised his eyes to meet the doctor's gaze, there was a depth of pain there that made several onlookers turn away. This wasn't just the loss of a pet. This was the severing of a bond, forged in fire and sustained through years of mutual dependence. Sheriff Pike holstered his weapon, the click of metal against leather unnaturally loud in the hushed street. He cleared his throat, preparing to address the crowd with the authority that had served him for 2 decades, but the words felt strange in his mouth. "The animal showed clear signs of aggression," he announced, his voice carrying less conviction than he intended. "I acted to protect the citizens of this town." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her flour-dusted apron now stained with tears. "Sheriff Pike," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion, "that dog never showed aggression toward anyone. He was as gentle as a lamb." Other voices began to murmur agreement. Duke had been a familiar sight on Thomas's monthly trips to town, and while the dog was certainly large and imposing, no one could remember him ever displaying threatening behavior. The growing skepticism in the crowd was like a physical weight pressing down on Pike's shoulders. Thomas finally stood, Duke's body cradled in his arms with the tenderness of a father carrying a sleeping child. The big man's face was streaked with dust and tears, but his voice when he spoke was steady and quiet. "I'll be taking him home now," he said, not looking at Pike or anyone else in particular. "Thank you for your kindness, Doc." The crowd parted as Thomas carried Duke to his wagon, laying the dog's body gently in the bed among the supplies he'd come to purchase. The mundane items, salt, coffee, ammunition, seemed suddenly insignificant in the face of such profound loss. Thomas climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, his movements automatic and precise despite the tremor in his hands. As the wagon pulled away from town, Sheriff Pike found himself standing alone in a circle of increasingly hostile faces. The authority he'd wielded so confidently just minutes before seemed to have evaporated like morning dew, leaving him exposed and vulnerable to questions he wasn't sure he could answer. That evening, Pike sat in his small office behind the jail, staring at a glass of whiskey that had grown warm in his hand. The events of the day replayed in his mind with relentless clarity, and each time he tried to justify his actions, the certainty slipped a little further away. Had Duke really shown signs of aggression? Or had Pike's own anxiety about maintaining order colored his perception until he saw threats where none existed? A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Doc Henley entered without waiting for permission, his face bearing the grim expression of a man who'd spent the afternoon asking uncomfortable questions. "Raymond," the doctor said, settling into the chair across from Pike's desk. "We need to talk." Pike looked up from his whiskey, noting the formal tone in the doctor's voice. In 30 years of friendship, Doc Henley had never used that particular combination of words. "About what happened today?" "About what's been happening to you for weeks," Doc replied, his medical training evident in the way he studied Pike's face. "You've been drinking more, sleeping less, seeing threats in every shadow. That's not the man this town elected sheriff." The accusation hit Pike like a physical blow, partly because it contained enough truth to sting. He'd been under pressure, yes, but that didn't mean his judgment was impaired, did it? "I did what needed to be done," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Doc Henley leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone he used with difficult patience. "Raymond, I served in the army. I know what a trained war dog looks like, and I know what aggressive behavior looks like. That animal you shot today was neither threatening nor dangerous." The words hung in the air between them like an indictment. Pike wanted to argue, to defend his actions with the righteous certainty that had sustained him through 20 years of law enforcement. But something in the doctor's eyes, disappointment perhaps, or pity, made the protests die in his throat. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," Pike said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The rustlers, the townspeople looking to me for protection, the responsibility—" "I understand more than you think," Doc interrupted. "But understanding doesn't change what happened today. A good man lost his closest companion because you let fear override good judgment. Pike drained his whiskey in one burning gulp, then set the glass down with more force than necessary. What do you want from me, Doc? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. Sorry I tried to protect this town from what I thought was a threat. Doc Henley stood to leave, but paused at the door. It's not my apology you need to be thinking about, Raymond. Thomas Ashford deserves better than what happened today, and deep down, you know it. After the doctor left, Pike sat alone in his office as shadows lengthened across the floor. The weight of his father's badge seemed to have doubled, pressing against his chest like a constant reminder of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. He'd built his identity around being the man who kept Dry Hollow safe, but what happened when the protector became the threat? Meanwhile, 3 miles east of town, Thomas knelt beside a freshly dug grave in a peaceful spot overlooking the valley. Duke's collar, worn leather that had seen action in 2 theaters of war, lay in Thomas's hands like a sacred relic. The simple metal tags bore the dog's name and unit designation, stark reminders of service and sacrifice that most people would never understand. You were the best of us. Old friend, Thomas said to the gathering darkness. The best of all of us. The night sounds of the countryside surrounded him. Crickets, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through grass. These were the sounds of peace, the gentle music of a world that had moved beyond war and violence. But for Thomas, sitting beside his companion's grave, peace felt further away than ever. In town, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the citizens of Dry Hollow were having conversations that would have made Sheriff Pike's blood run cold. Questions were being raised about judgment, about temperament, about whether the man they'd trusted to protect them had become something else entirely. The seeds of doubt, once planted, began to grow in the dark. Rachel Morrison had been marking papers by lamplight when word of the shooting reached her small house behind the schoolyard. The news came from young Tommy Walsh, the mayor's son, who burst through her door with the breathless urgency of a child who'd witnessed something beyond his understanding. "Miss Morrison!" he gasped, his eyes wide with shock. Sheriff Pike shot Mr. Ashford's dog right in the middle of town. Shot him dead for no reason anyone could see. Rachel set down her pen with careful deliberation, though her heart had begun racing at the boy's words. She'd known Thomas before the war, when they'd both been young and full of dreams about the future. He'd courted her with the shy determination of a man who believed in happy endings, bringing her wildflowers and walking her home from church socials with the kind of protective tenderness that had made her believe in love. The war had changed him, of course. The young man who'd left Dry Hollow full of patriotic fervor had returned as someone else entirely, hollow-eyed, withdrawn, carrying wounds that went deeper than flesh. Rachel had tried to reach him, had made overtures of friendship that he'd politely but firmly declined. The rejection had hurt, but she'd understood. Some wounds needed time and solitude to heal. Now, hearing about Duke's death, Rachel felt something crack open in her chest. That dog had been more than a pet to Thomas. Duke had been his anchor to the world, the one living thing that could still draw a smile from his war-weary face. Losing Duke would be devastating, but losing him to senseless violence would be something else entirely. The next morning, Rachel made her way to Thomas's ranch with a determination that surprised even her. She carried a basket of food, fresh bread, preserves, a pot of the beef stew that had been Thomas's favorite before the war. These were small gestures in the face of such profound loss, but they were what she had to offer. She found Thomas sitting on his porch, staring out across the valley with the kind of vacant expression she'd seen on the faces of other veterans. He looked up as her buggy approached, and for a moment she saw a flicker of the young man she'd once known. "Rachel," he said, standing with the automatic courtesy that had been drilled into him since childhood. "This isn't a good time." "There's never a good time for tragedy," she replied, climbing down from the buggy with the basket in her arms. "But that doesn't mean we face it alone." Thomas accepted the basket with reluctant grace, his eyes avoiding hers in the way of someone who'd forgotten how to accept kindness. "Thank you," he said simply. Though I'm not much company these days. Rachel studied his face, noting the new lines of grief etched around his eyes. I remember when you got Duke, she said quietly. You wrote to me from the army, told me about this remarkable dog who'd saved so many lives. You were so proud of him. The mention of Duke's service seemed to break something loose in Thomas's careful composure. His shoulders sagged, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories too heavy for one man to bear alone. He was more than just a dog, Rachel. Duke saved my life more times than I can count. Saved other men, too. Good men who got to go home to their families because that dog had a nose for finding the wounded and the heart to keep looking when everyone else gave up. Rachel stepped closer, her natural instinct to comfort overriding the careful distance Thomas had maintained between himself and the world. Tell me about him, she said. Tell me about the dog who was your friend. And so, for the first time since returning from the war, Thomas began to speak about the things he'd kept buried in his heart. He told her about Duke's training, about his uncanny ability to locate wounded soldiers in conditions that would defeat human searchers. He described the day they'd both earned their place in history, when Duke had worked tirelessly through a battlefield strewn with the dead and dying, finding 6 men who would have been lost without his persistence. The newspapers called me a hero, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. But Duke was the real hero that day. I just pointed him in the right direction and tried to keep up. As Thomas talked, Rachel found herself remembering the young man who'd captured her heart so many years ago. The gentleness was still there, buried under layers of pain and isolation, but real nonetheless. Duke's death had torn open wounds that Thomas had spent years trying to heal, but it had also revealed the depth of love he was still capable of feeling. Back in town, Sheriff Pike was dealing with his own crisis of confidence. The doubts that Doc Henley had voiced were echoing in conversations throughout Dry Hollow, and Pike could feel his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. Mayor Walsh had called an emergency meeting of the town council, and the subject under discussion was Pike's fitness to continue serving as sheriff. The meeting was held in the back room of Patterson's general store, behind closed doors that couldn't quite contain the heated voices within. Pike wasn't invited to defend himself, a pointed omission that spoke volumes about how far his standing had fallen in less than 24 hours. The man's been drinking more, complained Harvey Thornton, the town's banker. My wife saw him stumbling out of the saloon last Tuesday, barely able to walk a straight line. And that poor dog, Mrs. Patterson added, her voice tight with suppressed anger. I've seen Duke a dozen times, and he never showed anything but gentle behavior. Sheriff Pike saw what he wanted to see, not what was actually there. Mayor Walsh, ever the politician, tried to navigate between loyalty to an old friend and the demands of public opinion. Now let's not rush to judgment, he cautioned. Raymond Pike has served this community faithfully for 20 years. One mistake, interrupted Doc Henley, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the weight of his convictions. That wasn't a mistake, Harold. That was a man letting fear and paranoia override 20 years of experience. What happens next time when Pike decides someone else looks threatening? The questions hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere with doubt and recrimination. Pike's reputation, built over 2 decades of steady service, was crumbling under the weight of a single, terrible decision. Outside, the evening was settling over Dry Hollow with the peaceful quiet that made frontier towns like this seem timeless. But beneath the surface calm, something fundamental had shifted. The shooting of Duke had revealed fractures in the community's foundation, cracks that threatened to widen into something that might never fully heal. At his ranch, Thomas sat with Rachel on his porch as stars appeared in the darkening sky. For the first time since Duke's death, he wasn't alone with his grief, and the simple presence of another human being was both comforting and strange. What happens now? Rachel asked, her voice soft in the darkness. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that had no easy answers. I don't know, he said finally. For the first time in my life, I honestly don't know. 3 days after Duke's death, Thomas carved a simple wooden cross from a piece of oak that had fallen during the previous winter's storms. He worked with the patient precision of a man who understood that some tasks couldn't be hurried, his hands finding solace in the familiar rhythm of knife against wood. The cross was plain, unmarked except for Duke's name carved in letters deep enough to withstand years of weather. When Thomas placed the marker at the head of Duke's grave, he didn't expect visitors. The spot he'd chosen was peaceful but remote, overlooking the valley but hidden from the main road by a stand of cottonwoods. It was meant to be a private place where a man could remember his friend without the intrusion of curious eyes. But word of the memorial spread through Dry Hollow with the quiet persistence of all small-town news. It began with Rachel, who mentioned to Mrs. Patterson that Thomas had created a proper resting place for Duke. Mrs. Patterson, still struggling with her own guilt over not speaking up more forcefully during the shooting, shared the information with Doc Henley. From there, the story took on a life of its own. By the end of the week, Thomas was surprised to find fresh wildflowers placed at the base of the cross. Then came a small stone, painted with Duke's name, left by someone who preferred to remain anonymous. A handful of dog biscuits appeared next, wrapped in brown paper with a note that simply read, "For a good dog." Thomas stood beside the grave, holding the note and trying to understand the strange comfort these gestures brought him. He'd spent so many years avoiding human connection that he'd forgotten how healing simple kindness could be. The people of Dry Hollow were reaching out to him in the only way they knew how, acknowledging not just Duke's death, but the injustice of how it had happened. Sheriff Pike, meanwhile, had taken to making his rounds from the shadows. He still wore the badge and carried the authority of his office, but the easy confidence that had once marked his passage through town had vanished. People nodded when he passed, maintaining the bare minimum of courtesy his position demanded, but the warmth was gone. Conversation stopped when he approached and resumed only after he'd moved beyond earshot. The isolation was eating at Pike like a cancer. He'd never realized how much his identity was tied to the respect and trust of the community until both began to slip away. His father had warned him that wearing the badge meant making hard choices, but he'd never mentioned that some choices would haunt a man long after they were made. It was during one of these solitary patrols that Pike first noticed the pilgrimage to Duke's grave. From a distant hill, he watched through his spyglass as townspeople made their way to Thomas's ranch, some carrying flowers, others bearing small tokens of remembrance. The sight filled him with a complex mixture of emotions, guilt certainly, but also a strange kind of envy for the love and respect Duke had earned in life. The crisis that would force Pike and Thomas into direct cooperation came 3 weeks after the shooting, when the Brennan Ranch reported cattle missing and signs of the rustlers Pike had been dreading. The theft was bold, even by the standards of desperate. 40 head of prime beef taken in broad daylight while the family was in town for supplies. John Brennan rode into Dry Hollow with his hat pulled low and his face set in grim lines. He found Pike in the sheriff's office, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. "They hit us yesterday," Brennan announced without preamble. "Took 40 head and left sign pointing south toward the Badlands." Pike looked up from his coffee, noting the accusation in Brennan's eyes. The rancher's posture said clearly that he held the sheriff responsible for not preventing the theft, and Pike couldn't find the words to argue with that assessment. "How many riders?" Pike asked, falling back on the professional questions that might restore some semblance of competence. "Hard to say for certain. At least 6, maybe more. They knew what they were doing, cut out the best stock and left the rest alone." Brennan paused, studying Pike's face with the calculating gaze of a man weighing his options. "I'm organizing a posse. We need every gun we can get." The word "need" carried heavy emphasis, making it clear that Brennan's confidence in Pike's leadership had eroded considerably. The rancher was being polite, but barely, and both men knew it. Pike nodded, his mind already working through the logistics of pursuit. A posse would require careful organization and skilled tracking, especially if the rustlers had indeed fled into the Badlands, where the terrain favored those who knew it well. "I'll deputize 6 men and we'll ride at first light," he said. 7, Brennan corrected. "Thomas Ashford's already agreed to come. Man knows tracking better than anyone in the territory." The statement hit Pike like a physical blow. Thomas's agreement to help, despite what Pike had done to him, was both humbling and terrifying. It meant facing the man whose life he'd damaged, working alongside him while the wound of Duke's death remained fresh and unhealed. But Pike also knew that Brennan was right about Thomas's skills. The war had taught Thomas things about reading sign and following trails that most civilian trackers never learned. If they were going to have any chance of catching the rustlers, they needed Thomas's expertise. The posse assembled the next morning in the pale light before dawn. Pike counted 7 men besides himself: Brennan, Doc Henley, 2 ranch hands, the blacksmith's son, and Thomas Ashford. The dynamics were immediately clear. The other men deferred to Thomas's knowledge, while treating Pike with the cool courtesy due his official position, but little more. Thomas had arrived on a sturdy bay gelding, his rifle secured in a well-worn scabbard and his saddlebags packed with the efficiency of someone accustomed to long rides in hostile territory. He nodded politely to Pike, but offered no words beyond the necessities of coordination. "Trail leads south-southeast from Brennan's place," Thomas reported to the group, his voice carrying the quiet authority of expertise. "They're pushing the cattle hard, which means they're either confident about their destination or desperate to reach it." Pike found himself listening with the attention he might give to a senior officer, and the reversal of roles wasn't lost on either man. Here was Thomas, who'd never sought leadership or recognition, naturally taking charge of a situation that Pike's official authority couldn't handle alone. As they rode out of town, Pike caught glimpses of the man Thomas had been before Duke's death: focused, competent, possessed of the kind of steady courage that came from facing worse things than cattle rustlers. But he could also see the new shadows in Thomas's eyes, the weight of fresh grief that made every moment of their forced cooperation a reminder of Pike's failure. The trail led them through country that grew increasingly harsh as they moved away from the settled lands, around Dry Hollow. Here the grass was shorter, the water scarcer, and the rocks sharp enough to lame a horse whose rider wasn't paying attention. It was country that forgave no mistakes and rewarded only those who understood its unforgiving nature. Thomas rode point, reading the signs left by the stolen cattle and their thieves with an expertise that impressed even Pike. The rustlers were indeed skilled, but they'd made small errors that Thomas's trained eye could detect. A broken branch here, a displaced stone there, the subtle traces that marked their passage through the wilderness. As the day wore on and the trail grew more difficult to follow, Pike began to understand why the community had been so quick to embrace Thomas's participation in the posse. This wasn't just about his tracking skills, it was about his character, his willingness to help despite the wrong that had been done to him. The lesson was humbling, and Pike wasn't sure he was ready to learn it. Sheriff Pike's hands shook as he wrote the letter by lamplight, the words coming in fits and starts like confession torn from an unwilling penitent. The pursuit of the cattle rustlers had ended in success. They'd recovered most of Brennan's stolen herd and captured 4 of the 6 thieves, but Pike's role in the operation had been secondary at best. Thomas had led them to the rustlers' camp with the tactical brilliance of a man who understood both tracking and warfare, while Pike had followed along like a junior deputy learning the trade. The letter lay unfinished on Pike's desk, the words blurring as whiskey and shame fought for control of his thoughts. How could he apologize for destroying something irreplaceable? How could mere words address the magnitude of what he'd taken from Thomas Ashford? "Dear Mr. Ashford," he'd begun, then crossed out the formal address. "Thomas," he tried again, but that seemed too familiar for a man he'd wronged so deeply. The crumpled attempts at an opening accumulated beside his desk, like evidence of his inadequacy. Pike took another drink and tried a third time. "I know there are no words that can bring Duke back, and I know an apology can't undo what I did. But I need you to understand that I have been carrying the weight of my mistake every day since it happened. I saw a threat that wasn't there because I was afraid. Afraid of failing this town. Afraid of not living up to my father's legacy. Afraid of being the sheriff who let something terrible happen on his watch. He paused, studying the words that seemed both too much and too little. The truth was more complicated than fear, tangled up with pride and stubbornness and a lifetime of believing that his judgment was sufficient to protect the people who trusted him. But the truth was also exactly that simple. He'd been afraid, and his fear had killed an innocent creature. Meanwhile, Thomas's own healing had begun to take unexpected forms. The success of the posse had reminded him of skills he'd thought were buried with his military service, but more importantly, it had shown him that he could still be useful to the community. Word of his tracking expertise had spread, and now people came to him with problems that went beyond lost livestock. Rachel's visits had become a regular part of his week, arriving with food and conversation that gradually drew him back into connection with the world beyond his ranch. She had a teacher's patience with his struggles to express the emotions he'd kept locked away, and her presence made the empty spaces in his cabin seem less oppressive. On this particular evening, she found him working on a piece of leather, his hands steady despite the tremor that still visited him during times of stress. He was crafting a small collar, she realized, size for a dog that would never wear it. "Thomas," she said gently, settling beside him on the porch steps. "What are you making?" He'd looked down at the leather in his hands, his fingers tracing the careful stitching with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. "Something to remember him by," he said quietly. "Duke's collar was buried with him, but I needed something that would last." Rachel studied his profile in the lamplight, noting the way grief and memory played across his features. The war had aged him beyond his years, but Duke's death had revealed reserves of feeling that Thomas had thought were lost forever. "He meant everything to you," she observed. Not as a question, but a simple acknowledgement of truth. Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion he was still learning to express. "After the war, when I came back, I couldn't connect with people anymore. They seemed so far away, like I was watching life through glass." But Duke understood the silence. He didn't need explanations or apologies. He just stayed close and waited for me to find my way back to something like peace. "And did you find peace?" The question hung between them in the cooling evening air. Thomas set down the leather collar, his hands suddenly still. "I thought I had, or close enough to it. Duke, in this place, the work of ranching, staying away from complications, it felt like healing. But now," he trailed off, unable to put words to the complex mixture of grief and possibility that Rachel's friendship had awakened in him. Duke's death had torn open old wounds, but it had also forced him to confront the isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor. In town, the changes in both men had become a source of constant speculation. Doc Henley observed Pike's deteriorating condition with professional concern and personal disappointment. The sheriff, who'd once commanded respect through competence and fairness, was becoming a cautionary tale about the corrosive effects of guilt and alcohol. The doctor found Pike in the saloon on a Thursday evening, hunched over a glass that wasn't his first of the night. The crowd gave them space, sensing the gravity of the doctor's visit. "Raymond," Doc Henley said, sliding onto the adjacent stool. "We need to talk about your drinking." Pike looked up with eyes that had become habitually defensive. "I'm off duty, Doc. A man's entitled to a drink after a long day." "A drink, yes. But you're well past that point, and we both know it." The doctor's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen the early stages of self-destruction too many times to ignore. "You're killing yourself by degrees, and it's not bringing Duke back or erasing what happened." The mention of Duke hit Pike like a physical blow, causing him to flinch visibly. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice raw with suppressed emotion. "You think I don't see that dog every time I close my eyes? You think I don't hear him dying every time it gets quiet?" Doc Henley leaned closer, his voice dropping to the confidential tone he used with patience in crisis. "Then do something about it." Stop drowning in guilt and start figuring out how to make things right. How? Pike's question was barely above a whisper. How do you make right something that can never be undone? The doctor was quiet for a long moment, considering the complexity of redemption and forgiveness. I don't know, Raymond, but I know drinking yourself to death isn't the answer. Pike stared into his glass, as if it might contain wisdom instead of whiskey. The weight of his father's badge seemed to increase with every drink, every sleepless night, every moment of recognition that his authority rested on a foundation that was crumbling beneath his feet. "The town's losing faith in me," he said finally, stating the obvious truth that everyone had been too polite to voice directly. "Yes," Doc Henley agreed, seeing no point in false comfort. "But that doesn't mean it's too late to earn it back. Thomas Ashford showed remarkable grace during the posse. He worked with you despite what you'd taken from him. There's a lesson there if you're willing to learn it." Pike nodded slowly, though whether he was agreeing with the doctor's assessment or simply acknowledging the hopelessness of his situation remained unclear. The letter he'd been trying to write sat unfinished on his desk, a monument to intentions that couldn't quite overcome the paralysis of shame. Outside the saloon, Dry Hollow settled into its evening rhythms, but the undercurrents of change continued to flow beneath the surface calm. The shooting of Duke had revealed fault lines in the community's foundation, but it had also begun a process of healing that no one could have anticipated. The question was whether Sheriff Pike would find the courage to participate in that healing, or whether his guilt would consume him before redemption became possible. The truth about Duke emerged from an unexpected source, a faded photograph tucked inside Thomas's war journal, discovered by Rachel during one of her visits when Thomas had stepped outside to tend to his evening chores. She hadn't meant to pry, but the journal had fallen open to a page marked with the photograph, and the image it revealed changed everything she thought she knew about the dog Pike had killed. The photograph showed Thomas in his military uniform, younger and harder-faced than the man she knew now. He stood with his cavalry unit, 12 men arranged in formal ranks for what was clearly an official military portrait. But what caught Rachel's breath was the dog sitting at attention in the front row, wearing a harness that bore the distinctive markings of a military working animal. Duke hadn't just been Thomas's companion during the war, he'd been an official member of the unit, a decorated service animal with training and credentials that most civilian lawmen would never encounter. The photograph's caption, written in Thomas's careful script, read, "Duke and the men of the 7th Cavalry, after the Battle of Copper Ridge. 12 lives saved by one dog's determination." When Thomas returned to find Rachel holding the photograph, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, then resignation. He'd kept Duke's military service private not out of shame, but because explaining it required telling stories about the war that he preferred to leave buried. He was more than just a companion, wasn't he? Rachel asked quietly, her voice filled with new understanding of the magnitude of Pike's mistake. Thomas sat heavily beside her, taking the photograph with the reverence of a man handling a sacred relic. "Duke was a certified medical service dog," he said, his voice thick with memories. "Trained to locate wounded soldiers on the battlefield, to distinguish between the living and the dead, even in the worst conditions. He saved more lives than any medal could recognize." The story that followed was one of remarkable heroism and partnership. Duke had been trained by the Army's best handlers, selected from hundreds of candidates for his intelligence, courage, and unshakable composure under fire. His record included 12 confirmed saves during the Battle of Copper Ridge, but dozens of other instances where his keen senses had meant the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. After the war, when they were going to retire him to a civilian family, "I couldn't bear the thought of him being separated from everything he'd known," Thomas continued. "I petitioned to adopt him, used every favor and connection I had. Duke had earned the right to choose his own peace." Rachel studied the photograph again, noting details she'd missed on first glance. Duke's harness bore ribbons that she now recognized as military decorations, and his posture in the formal portrait suggested the discipline of a soldier rather than the casual obedience of a pet. "Sheriff Pike had no way of knowing," she said, though her voice carried more sadness than forgiveness. "No," Thomas agreed. "But that's what makes it so tragic." Pike saw what he expected to see, a potentially dangerous animal, instead of what was actually there. Duke had been trained to read human distress signals, to approach people who needed help. Pike's agitation would have triggered Duke's rescue instincts, not his aggression. The implications of this revelation rippled through both of their minds. Pike hadn't just killed a beloved pet, he'd killed a war hero, an animal whose service record would have commanded respect from any military officer. The senselessness of the tragedy deepened, but so did the complexity of the path toward forgiveness. Rachel knew this information had to be shared, but she also understood the delicate nature of the situation. Pike was already spiraling towards self-destruction under the weight of his guilt. Learning that he'd killed a decorated military service dog might push him over an edge from which there would be no return. "What will you do with this?" she asked, indicating the photograph and the story it represented. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing Duke's image with the gentleness he'd once shown the living animal. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me thinks people should know what Duke really was, what his service meant. But another part of me worries about what this knowledge would do to Pike." The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on both of them. Revealing Duke's true nature would vindicate Thomas in the eyes of the community and expose the full magnitude of Pike's error. But it might also destroy whatever remained of the sheriff's sanity and self-respect. 3 days later, the decision was taken out of Thomas's hands when Doc Henley arrived at his ranch with news that Sheriff Pike had been found unconscious in his office, a half-empty bottle of laudanum beside him, and Thomas's war journal spread open on his desk. "He broke into your place last night," Doc Henley explained, his face grave with concern. "Took the journal and spent the night reading it. When I found him this morning, he was mumbling about medals and heroes and how he'd killed the best of them all." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Pike had not only violated his privacy, but had discovered Duke's military record in the worst possible way, alone, drunk, and consumed with guilt that was already eating him alive. "Is he going to live?" Thomas asked, surprised by his own concern for the man who'd caused him such pain. "Physically, yes, but mentally," Doc Henley shook his head. "He's broken, Thomas, completely broken. He keeps asking for you, saying he needs to make it right before it's too late." The ride to town felt like the longest journey Thomas had ever taken. He found Pike in Doc Henley's clinic, propped up in bed with the grey pallor of a man who'd looked into his own soul and found it wanting. Pike's eyes, when they met Thomas's, were filled with a despair so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "I didn't know," Pike whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know he was a hero. I didn't know he'd saved so many lives. I killed a hero, Thomas. I killed the best among us." Thomas pulled a chair close to Pike's bedside, his own emotions a complex mixture of anger, pity, and something approaching understanding. "You couldn't have known," he said quietly. "I never told anyone about Duke's service record, but I should have looked deeper," Pike insisted, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I should have asked questions, should have given you both the benefit of the doubt. Instead, I let fear make me into something I never wanted to be." The sight of Pike's complete breakdown stirred something unexpected in Thomas's heart. This wasn't the arrogant lawman who'd gunned down his companion. This was a fellow human being drowning in remorse, destroyed by the recognition of what his hasty judgment had cost. "Pike," Thomas said, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised both men. "Duke's medals and citations don't make his death any more or less tragic than it already was. He was a good dog who deserved better, whether he was a decorated war hero or just a faithful companion." Pike's eyes searched Thomas's face, looking for signs of the anger and hatred he believed he deserved. Instead, he found something infinitely more powerful and healing, compassion from the very man he'd wronged most deeply. "How can you not hate me?" Pike asked, his voice breaking on the words. "How can you sit there and show me kindness when I took away the thing you loved most in the world?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that went to the heart of forgiveness and redemption. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Because hating you won't bring Duke back," he said simply, "and because I've seen enough hatred in my lifetime to know it destroys the one who carries it more than the one it's aimed at. Duke wouldn't want me to become bitter over his death. He'd want me to find a way to heal." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either man had experienced, a raw, honest examination of guilt, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption. Pike spoke about his fears, his desperate need to live up to his father's legacy, his growing paranoia about threats that existed more in his imagination than in reality. Thomas listened with the patience of someone who understood the weight of carrying invisible wounds. When Mayor Walsh arrived at the clinic that evening, he found the two men in quiet conversation, Pike's confession having evolved into something approaching reconciliation. The mayor had come to discuss Pike's resignation, a formality that the town council had agreed was necessary, but the scene he encountered gave him pause. "Gentlemen," Walsh said carefully, his political instincts sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand, "I trust you're both managing this difficult situation with appropriate gravity." Thomas looked up at the mayor, then back at Pike, who was watching him with the desperate hope of a man seeking absolution. In that moment, Thomas made a decision that would reshape not only his own future, but the future of Dry Hollow itself. "Mayor Walsh," Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had marked his military leadership, "I think it's time the community learned the whole truth about what happened. All of it. The revelation of Duke's military service sent shockwaves through Dry Hollow that reverberated far beyond the town's borders. When the full story emerged, the decorated war dog, the life-saving medical training, the dozen men who owed their lives to Duke's courage and determination, the community's understanding of the tragedy shifted dramatically. Pike's error was revealed not just as a mistake in judgment, but as the destruction of a genuine hero whose service deserved recognition and remembrance. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on everyone who heard it, but heaviest of all on the sheriff who had pulled the trigger. The weight of knowing Duke's true nature had transformed Sheriff Pike's guilt into something approaching despair. 3 days after his discovery of Thomas's war journal, Pike sat alone in his small house behind the jail, staring at the service revolver his father had carried for 30 years. The weapon lay on the kitchen table like an accusation, its polished surface reflecting the lamplight with cold indifference. The letter he'd been trying to write to Thomas remained unfinished, the words seeming more inadequate with each passing hour. How could mere language express the magnitude of what he'd destroyed? Duke hadn't just been a companion, he'd been a living monument to courage and service. A hero whose story deserved to be told in halls of honor rather than whispered in regret. Pike's hands shook as he reached for the revolver, the metal cold against his palm. The easy solution beckoned like a dark promise. One bullet would end the pain, would spare the community the embarrassment of a sheriff who'd fallen so far from grace. His father had taught him that a man took responsibility for his mistakes, but some mistakes were too large for any living person to carry. The sound of footsteps on his porch interrupted Pike's dark contemplations. He quickly pushed the gun aside as a knock came at his door, followed by a familiar voice calling his name. "Sheriff Pike? It's Thomas Ashford. We need to talk." Pike's blood turned to ice. The last person he expected or felt worthy to face was standing outside his door, and there was nowhere to hide from the confrontation he'd been dreading. With trembling hands, he opened the door to find Thomas standing in the evening light, his face grave but not hostile. "May I come in?" Thomas asked, and Pike stepped aside wordlessly, unable to trust his voice. The two men sat across from each other at Pike's small table, the revolver now hidden in Pike's lap like a guilty secret. Thomas's eyes took in the details of the sheriff's decline, the unwashed clothes, the empty bottles, the hollow-eyed desperation of a man at the end of his rope. "I know you've been thinking about that gun," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd faced similar darkness. "Doc Henley told me about your condition when he found you. The laudanum, the journal, the things you said about not being able to live with what you'd done." Pike's grip tightened on the hidden weapon, surprised by Thomas's directness. "You don't understand." "I understand better than you think," Thomas interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "I've been where you are. Pike, after the war, when I first came back, I spent months with a loaded gun beside my bed, thinking about how easy it would be to just end the nightmares. The revelation hung in the air between them. Two veterans recognizing the shared territory of despair. Pike raised his eyes to meet Thomas's gaze, seeing something he hadn't expected, understanding rather than condemnation. "The difference," Thomas continued, "is that I hadn't hurt anyone else. My demons were internal, battles with memory and guilt that belonged only to me. But you're carrying something heavier, the knowledge that your actions took a life that didn't deserve to be lost." Pike's control finally broke, tears streaming down his face as the words he'd been holding back poured out in a torrent of confession and self-recrimination. "I killed him, Thomas. I killed a hero because I was too afraid and too proud to look past my own fears. Duke saved 12 men's lives, and I ended his because I couldn't tell the difference between aggression and concern." Thomas listened without interruption, allowing Pike to purge himself of the poison that had been eating him alive. When the sheriff's words finally ran out, Thomas spoke with the measured cadence of someone who'd learned hard lessons about survival and redemption. "Duke's death was a tragedy," he said simply, "but your death won't bring him back. It will only create another tragedy, another family destroyed, another life wasted, because healing seemed harder than dying." Pike looked up in confusion. "Family? I don't have—" "You have this town," Thomas interrupted. "The people who've depended on you for 20 years, who still need you despite your mistakes. You have the chance to honor Duke's memory not through self-destruction, but through the kind of service he represented." The conversation that followed stretched deep into the night, two men sharing the kinds of truth that emerge only in moments of absolute honesty. Thomas spoke about his own struggles with survivor's guilt, about the weight of being called a hero when so many better men had died. Pike talked about his father's legacy, about the crushing pressure of living up to an idealized memory while dealing with challenges his father had never faced. "The night before the battle where Duke and I earned our decorations," Thomas said, his voice distant with memory, "I was ready to desert. The casualties had been so heavy, the fighting so brutal, that I didn't think I could face another day of it. Duke seemed to sense my despair. He stayed closer than usual, never leaving my side." Pike listened with the desperate attention of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. When morning came and the attack began, I fought not because I was brave, but because Duke was counting on me. He'd found wounded men in impossible places, under fire that would have sent most soldiers running. If that dog could show that kind of courage, how could I show less? Thomas paused, studying Pike's face in the lamplight. "Duke saved my life not just by finding me when I was wounded, but by showing me what it meant to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. His death doesn't have to be meaningless if it teaches us the same lesson." As dawn approached, Pike made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of reaching for the gun that promised an end to his pain, he reached for the pen and paper that offered the possibility of redemption. The letter he wrote to the people of Dry Hollow was unlike any document ever produced in the territory, a sheriff's public confession of error, a request for forgiveness, and a commitment to earning back the trust he'd squandered through fear and hasty judgment. To the citizens of Dry Hollow, he wrote in careful script, "I write this letter to confess publicly to the gravest error of my career and to ask for your forgiveness, though I know I may not deserve it. When I shot and killed Duke, I believed I was protecting our community from a dangerous animal. I now know that I was tragically, inexcusably wrong. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing not just the facts of Duke's military service, but Pike's own recognition of how fear and pride had clouded his judgment. He wrote about his father's legacy, about the pressure he'd felt to maintain order at any cost, and about his growing understanding that true law enforcement required wisdom and restraint rather than quick action. Most importantly, he wrote about Thomas's grace in the face of unforgivable loss, and about the lessons that both men had learned through their unlikely partnership during the cattle rustlers' pursuit. "I do not ask for your sympathy," the letter concluded, "but I do ask for the opportunity to serve this community better than I have in recent months. Mr. Ashford has shown me what true courage looks like, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with wisdom and compassion despite that fear. If you will allow me to continue as your sheriff, I promise to honor the memory of Duke and the service he represented by becoming worthy of the badge I have worn for 20 years. When Thomas read the finished letter, he found himself moved by Pike's honesty and humbled by the references to his own role in the sheriff's transformation. The man who'd sat across from him, with a loaded gun just hours earlier, had found the strength to choose a different path, the harder path of living with his mistakes while working to transcend them. The decision of what to do with Pike's confession would rest with the community, but Thomas knew that the act of writing it had already begun the process of redemption for both men. Duke's death had been a tragedy, but perhaps it could also become the catalyst for something better, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal if approached with patience, wisdom, and grace. The morning sun was rising over Dry Hollow as Pike prepared to face his community with the truth of what he'd done and who he hoped to become. The gun remained on the table, but it no longer held the power to tempt him. He'd chosen the harder path, the one that led toward redemption rather than escape. Thomas stood beside him as they prepared to walk to the town square, where the community would gather to hear Pike's confession. 2 men bound together by tragedy, but walking toward the possibility of healing. The memorial service for Duke took place on a Sunday morning, when the autumn air carried the promise of winter, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned the color of burnished gold. Thomas had never intended for the gathering to become a public event, but word of Pike's confession and the revelation of Duke's military service had transformed what should have been a private moment of remembrance into something approaching a town ceremony. The service was held at Duke's grave, where the simple wooden cross now stood surrounded by flowers, small stones painted with messages of respect, and other tokens left by townspeople who'd come to understand the magnitude of what had been lost. Rachel had helped organize the gathering, working with Mrs. Patterson and Doc Henley to create a program that honored both Duke's service and the community's need for healing. Thomas stood beside the grave wearing his only good suit, his war medals pinned to his chest for the first time since returning from the frontier campaigns. The Congressional Medal of Honor caught the morning sunlight, a reminder of heroism that felt both distant and immediate. Beside him, Rachel held a small bouquet of wildflowers, her presence a steady comfort in a moment that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. The crowd that had gathered was larger than anyone had expected. Ranchers had ridden in from miles around, drawn by the story of Duke's heroism and the unusual circumstances of the memorial. Town residents stood shoulder to shoulder with cowboys, merchants beside homesteaders, all united by a shared recognition of loss and the hope for redemption. Mayor Walsh opened the service with words that struck the right balance between solemnity and celebration, acknowledging Duke's death while honoring his life of service. Doc Henley read from Scripture, choosing passages about faithfulness and sacrifice that seemed to speak directly to the assembled mourners. Mrs. Patterson shared memories of Duke's gentle behavior during Thomas's visits to town, painting a picture of an animal whose character had been evident to anyone who'd taken the time to look. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. When Sheriff Pike stepped forward to address the community he'd served for 20 years, and the man he'd wronged so deeply. Pike looked older than his 53 years as he stood before the crowd, his uniform freshly pressed but unable to disguise the weight he'd lost, or the lines that grief had etched around his eyes. He held his prepared remarks in hands that trembled slightly, but when he began to speak, his voice carried the clear authority of a man who'd found the courage to face his failures. "I stand before you today, not as your sheriff, but as a man seeking forgiveness for an unforgivable mistake," he began, his words carrying across the gathering with the clarity of confession long overdue. "When I shot and killed Duke, I believed I was protecting our community. I now know that I destroyed something precious, not just a faithful companion, but a genuine hero whose service to our country deserved recognition. Not a bullet." Pike paused, his eyes finding Thomas in the crowd, seeking permission to continue with the most difficult part of his confession. Thomas nodded almost imperceptibly, his own face showing the strain of reliving painful memories in such a public forum. "Duke was a decorated military service dog," Pike continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He saved 12 men during the Battle of Copper Ridge, working under enemy fire to locate wounded soldiers who would have died without his courage and determination. He earned military decorations for valor, and he spent his retirement years helping his human companion heal from the invisible wounds of war." The crowd stirred at this revelation, many hearing the full story of Duke's service for the first time. The magnitude of Pike's error became clear as the sheriff detailed the dog's training, his record of life-saving interventions, and his continued service to veterans even after leaving the military. "I killed a hero because I let fear override judgment," Pike said, his voice breaking slightly on the admission. "I saw what I expected to see rather than what was actually there. Duke's training would have made him approach me with concern, not aggression. But I was too blinded by my own paranoia to recognize the difference." Thomas stepped forward then, his presence commanding the attention of everyone gathered at the graveside. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom and unexpected grace. "Sheriff Pike has asked for forgiveness, and I want you all to know that he has mine," Thomas said, his voice clear and strong. "Duke's death was a tragedy that can never be undone, but it doesn't have to be meaningless. Pike's confession today takes courage, and courage in the face of our failures is something Duke would have respected." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods and the distant call of geese heading south for the winter. Then slowly, members of the community began to nod their understanding and acceptance. Pike removed his badge with shaking hands and held it out to Mayor Walsh. "I resign my position as sheriff. Effective immediately," he announced. "I'm not worthy to wear this badge after what I've done." But before Walsh could accept the resignation, Thomas stepped forward with words that would change everything. "Sheriff Pike," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the morning air with quiet authority, "Duke wouldn't want your career to end in shame. He'd want it to continue with wisdom." The crowd stirred at Thomas's unexpected intervention, and Pike looked up with confusion and desperate hope. The badge remained extended toward Mayor Walsh, but Thomas's words had created a moment of possibility that no one had anticipated. "I've served with many men in my time," Thomas continued, his gaze moving from Pike to the assembled townspeople. "I've seen good men make terrible mistakes under pressure, and I've seen those same men find the strength to become better than they were before. Sheriff Pike's confession today shows the kind of character that Duke would have recognized and respected." Rachel stepped forward to stand beside Thomas, her presence adding weight to his words. As the schoolteacher, she commanded respect in the community, and her support for Thomas's position carried significant influence. "The children in my classroom make mistakes every day," she said, her voice warm with the patience of someone who understood human fallibility. "What matters isn't the mistake itself, but what they learn from it and how they choose to grow. Sheriff Pike has shown us today that he's learned from his error in the most profound way possible. Doc Henley nodded his agreement. His medical training having taught him about the healing power of accountability and forgiveness. "I've watched Raymond Pike serve this community faithfully for 20 years, he said. One terrible mistake doesn't erase 2 decades of dedicated service, especially when that mistake has led to such deep self-examination and growth." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, the sentiment gradually shifting from condemnation towards something approaching redemption. Pike stood frozen, the badge still extended, unsure whether to believe what seemed to be happening. Mayor Walsh, ever the politician, sensed the changing mood and adjusted his approach accordingly. "The question before us isn't whether Sheriff Pike made a grievous error," he said carefully. "The question is whether we believe in the possibility of redemption and second chances." Mrs. Patterson pushed forward through the crowd, her face set with determination. "Sheriff Pike," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd watched the community's children grow to adulthood. "I've seen you help countless families through difficult times. I've watched you show mercy when the law might have demanded harshness. One mistake doesn't define a lifetime of service." Other voices began to join hers, townspeople sharing memories of Pike's compassion and dedication over the years. John Brennan spoke about Pike's leadership during the cattle rustler crisis, noting how the sheriff had deferred to Thomas's expertise without letting pride interfere with the mission. The blacksmith's son recalled Pike's patience in dealing with youthful indiscretions, and several widows mentioned his help during their times of greatest need. Pike lowered the badge slowly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What I did was unforgivable. Forgiveness isn't about what we deserve," Thomas replied, his own voice gentle with understanding. "It's about what we choose to give, and what we choose to do with the grace we receive." Duke saved lives because it was his nature to help, not because those lives necessarily deserved saving. The least we can do is honor his memory by showing the same kind of unconditional service. The memorial service had transformed into something none of them had expected, a moment of community, healing that went far beyond honoring Duke's memory. In confronting Pike's failure and choosing forgiveness over condemnation, the people of Dry Hollow were discovering their own capacity for grace. Mayor Walsh stepped forward, his political instincts finally aligned with genuine sentiment. "Sheriff Pike, on behalf of the town council and the citizens of Dry Hollow, I believe the community would be better served by your continued service than by your resignation. However, I propose that you serve for the remainder of your term under the supervision of a deputy sheriff chosen by this community." The crowd turned to look at Thomas, the obvious choice for such a position, but he shook his head with a gentle smile. "I'm not meant to wear a badge," he said. "My service takes different forms, but I know someone who would serve this community well in that capacity." Before anyone could ask who he meant, Thomas surprised everyone by suggesting that the community look beyond Dry Hollow for their new deputy. "There's a young officer in the territorial capital who's looking for a chance to serve a community that values wisdom over quick action. His name is James Crawford, and he served under me during the frontier campaigns. He understands what it means to make life-and-death decisions, and he has the temperament to serve as a steadying influence." Pike looked up with something approaching hope. The idea of serving under supervision, of having someone to help guide his decisions and check his impulses, felt not like punishment, but like salvation. "I would welcome such an arrangement," he said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. The crowd's murmur of approval sealed the decision. Sheriff Pike would continue in his role, but with the humility that comes from recognizing one's own fallibility and the wisdom that emerges from genuine accountability. As the memorial service concluded, Thomas knelt beside Duke's grave one final time, placing a small American flag next to the wooden cross. "Rest easy, old friend," he whispered. "Your last mission was the most important one of all." 1 year later, Dry Hollow had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The bronze statue of Duke that now stood in the town square served as a daily reminder of the price of hasty judgment and the power of redemption. The inscription at the base, written in Thomas's careful script, read simply, "Duke, hero in war and peace. His greatest victory was teaching us how to forgive." The morning of Thomas and Rachel's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains seem close enough to touch. The ceremony was to be held in the church, but the celebration would spill out into the streets where the entire community had gathered to honor the union of two people whose love had emerged from tragedy and grown stronger through trials. Thomas stood at the altar wearing his dress uniform, the same one he'd worn in the photograph with Duke and his cavalry unit. The Congressional Medal of Honor caught the light streaming through the church's simple windows, but today it felt less like a burden and more like a bridge between past and future. Beside him, Deputy James Crawford served as his best man, the young officer having become both a trusted colleague and a genuine friend in the months since his arrival in Dry Hollow. Sheriff Pike sat in the second row, wearing his freshly pressed uniform with the quiet dignity of a man who'd found peace with his limitations and strength in his accountability. The year of serving under Crawford's steady guidance had restored both his confidence and the community's trust, though he would never again make a significant decision without seeking counsel from others. Rachel walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her face radiant with the joy of a woman who'd waited years for love to find its way back to her. Her students had scattered flower petals along her path, and their excited whispers filled the church with the kind of innocent delight that made even the most solemn occasions feel touched by grace. Doc Henley performed the ceremony with the gentle authority of someone who'd watched both bride and groom navigate their separate journeys toward this moment. His words about love, commitment, and the courage required to build a life together resonated throughout the small church, carrying special meaning for a community that had learned hard lessons about judgment, forgiveness, and second chances. "Thomas," Doc Henley said as the couple exchanged vows, "do you promise to love Rachel with the same faithfulness you showed Duke, the same commitment you showed your fellow soldiers, and the same grace you've shown this community in its moments of greatest need?" "I do," Thomas replied, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to love her with everything I have and everything I've learned about what love really means." When it came time for the rings, Pike stepped forward with a small velvet box, his role as ring-bearer a gesture of trust that had taken months to arrange. The rings themselves were simple gold bands, but the moment when Pike placed them in Thomas's hands carried the weight of redemption and renewal. The celebration that followed filled the town square, with tables laden with food prepared by every family in Dry Hollow and beyond. Music drifted from a small band of local musicians, and children ran between the adults with the boundless energy of youth at a party. It was the kind of community gathering that frontier towns did best, impromptu, heartfelt, and inclusive of everyone who called the place home. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself standing beside Duke's memorial statue, a moment of quiet reflection in the midst of the celebration. The bronze captured Duke's alert, intelligent expression perfectly, and Thomas could almost imagine his old friend's approval of the day's events. Sheriff Pike approached slowly, carrying 2 glasses of punch and wearing the careful expression of someone who still wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. The relationship between the two men had evolved over the past year into something that wasn't quite friendship, but went deeper than mere professional courtesy. "He would have liked this," Pike said, indicating the celebration with a nod of his head. Duke always seemed to enjoy it when people were happy. Thomas accepted the punch with a smile that held no trace of the old pain. He would have been right in the middle of it all, probably trying to steal food from the tables and getting away with it because everyone loved him too much to scold him properly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 2 men who'd learned to find peace in each other's company, despite the tragedy that had brought them together. The lessons of that terrible day had shaped both of them in ways they were still discovering. "I got word yesterday that the territorial governor wants to present Duke with a posthumous commendation," Pike said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and lingering regret. "They're calling it the Territory's Medal for Canine Valor, first one they've ever awarded." Thomas nodded, touched by the recognition, but knowing that Duke's true legacy lay in the changes his death had wrought in the hearts of those who'd known him. "He'd probably be more interested in the celebration than the medal," he said. Duke never cared much for ceremonies. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Thomas and Rachel prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a week in Denver that would serve as both a wedding trip and Thomas's first real journey away from Dry Hollow since his return from the war. The community gathered to see them off, showering them with rice and good wishes as they climbed into the decorated wagon that would take them to the train station. Rachel settled beside her new husband, her hand finding his with the natural ease of long affection finally allowed to flourish. As they pulled away from the square, she turned for one last look at Duke's statue, now illuminated by the warm glow of lanterns that the townspeople had hung for the celebration. "He's still watching over all of us," she said softly, her voice filled with the certainty of someone who'd witnessed the power of love to transform even the deepest grief. Thomas nodded, his own eyes on the bronze figure that had become Dry Hollow's guardian angel. "Always will be," he agreed. "That's what heroes do. They keep saving lives long after the battles are over." The wagon rolled through the gathering dusk toward a future bright with possibility, carrying two people whose love had been forged in the crucible of loss and tempered by the grace of forgiveness. Behind them, Dry Hollow settled into evening peace, a community forever changed by the memory of a dog who taught them that true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with wisdom and compassion despite that fear. Duke's greatest victory hadn't been on any battlefield. It had been in the hearts of those he'd left behind, teaching them that even the worst mistakes could become the foundation for something beautiful if approached with humility, accountability, and grace.